And the EU piling pressure on Moscow over its war in Ukraine. The bloc has proposed a sixth package of sanctions targeting Russian oil and top lender Sberbank. Let's take a deeper dive into the EU's sanction plan against Russia. Will Denslow joins us live now from Riga, Latvia. Will, what has Russia's response been to this latest round of sanctions? I mean, how do you expect that they're going to retaliate? Because they have said that they will before.
Jordan, it's much the same. We've heard from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, who says that Russia is now debating a range of response options. This, of course, comes as Vladimir Putin has signed a decree really invoking yet another round of sanctions on Ukraine's allies. There haven't been details on who will be included in those sanctions. That's set to come in the following 10 days as a list is being drawn up. But Vladimir Putin says that this is a response to unfriendly actions from unfriendly nations and entities. We've also heard from Dmitry Peskov, who's described these sanctions put on Russia as a double-edged weapon, and that we can expect to see prices for residents in Europe going up every single day. Of course, this very much is part of a theme that Russia has been pushing, very much stating that these sanctions put on them by the West have been, as they put it, an own goal.
And as this war drags on, Will, Ukraine is warning that Belarus could join Russia's war effort. I mean, we know that Belarus is an ally to Russia, but does Russia actually plan to utilize the armed forces of Belarus here?
The message from those in Belarus is an overwhelming no. Of course, military drills started on Wednesday. They say this is purely to achieve combat readiness. They've essentially told their neighbours, they've told the European bloc that they have nothing to worry about as far as Belarus is concerned. We have, though, heard from officials on the Ukrainian border. They say they've ramped up security on the Belarusian border. They say they haven't ruled out the possibility that Russian forces might be deployed from Belarus, or the Belarusian army itself might directly be involved in the conflict as well. There are also concerns coming from Moldova, especially when it comes to the breakaway region of Transnistria. We have, though, heard from Moldova's president, who stated that there is no imminent threat for the war escalating or essentially being created in Moldova as well, but that is something they say they're watching closely. When it comes to May 9th, of course, that critical date in the Russian calendar, Dmitry Peskov has downplayed speculation that Russia might declare a wider war on that particular date. He has said that those claims are nonsense.
Will, thank you. Will Denslow there in Riga, Latvia.
The European Union is betting on this latest sanctions package proposal hitting Russia hard. But not all member states would be in agreement. For more on the impact these moves could have on Russia and Europe, we're joined by Pushan Dutt. He's Professor of Economics and Political Science at INSEAD. Professor Dutt, not just not in agreement about whether or not this will hit Russia hard, the 27 EU member states may not even agree to launch these sanctions because we're already hearing Hungary and Slovakia, they're going to get more time to reach this phased-in ban. They might have financial aid packages, alternative supplies being provided for them. Is it realistic to even expect the EU to reach agreement on this phased-in ban on Russian oil exports?
So I'm not too much worried about that. It's correct that in the European Union, all 27 members have to agree before anything gets decided. And this question is being raised, whether they're going to be unified on this. I'm convinced about this because I think if you look at the details, there are sufficient degrees of flexibility which is available to the European Union. One easy thing to do is to allow a longer phase-in or phase-out period of Russian oil and refined products. They've right now set it to 6 months to a year, But what they can do is they can tell Hungary and Slovakia, the ones who are most worried about this, is that they can continue to import Russian oil, for instance, for a period of 12 months instead of 6 months. So I think there's sufficient flexibility here. The bigger question I think that we should really be focusing on is whether the European Union and its citizens are prepared to take the shock of rising prices for fuel and electricity. So stagflation is already here. Economies in the US, like the US and the European Union, are slowing down and inflation is surging. So this is where I'm sort of more worried. The longer the war goes on, the harder it will be for the Western alliance to maintain its unity and resolve.
I'll pick up on that point. Germany's economy minister warning, he has said the era of cheap energy is over. These price rises will be permanent. Do consumers in the European Union, have they factored that in? When they're at the pump paying more or in the supermarkets paying more for food, are they going to be thinking it's worth it, the price to pay for democracy is much higher cost of living?
I think it just depends on how they build political support for this. I'm less worried about Europe because I think the shock of a major land war in Europe, the first since World War II, has really sort of unified them. I'm a little bit more worried about the US. Elections are coming in the US. They are likely to get distracted by things like the abortion debate with Roe versus Wade falling. So I'm less worried about Europe. And I think if it is framed properly, if it is sold properly to the public, it is likely that they are going to support it. But there is a time issue here. The longer the war goes on, the harder it becomes to actually maintain this kind of support and faith. So therefore, European governments, Western governments have faced this impossible conundrum. Their citizens have faced a big constraint on the government. They want their leaders to respond to the invasion, but they don't actually want any military intervention. They sympathize with the plight of the Ukrainians, but they are not willing to take too much economic pain, which is likely to result if they have a more effective sanctions regime. The longer the time goes, the more stark this trade-off is going to start looking.
So if we could pick up from an earlier point made by my colleague Dawn when she was speaking to our correspondent in Riga, he said Russia's retaliation is to say this is an own goal on the part of the EU. In other words, you launch these sanctions, but the cost will be paid by your own people. That is Russia's best retaliation. Or could they do more? So, for example, cutting off supplies to, as they did recently, to Poland and Hungary. Could they do that again sooner before other countries are able to get their alternative supplies up and running?
So I think it's just the spike in oil prices and therefore the spike in fuel and electricity prices in Europe that's going to create pain for European citizens. Russia actually does not have too many tools at its disposal to seriously retaliate. This is the peril of having an economy which is overwhelmingly reliant on natural resources and commodities. I think we should also step back and ask the following question, that what would Russia do if the West, if Europe and the US and Canada stop buying its oil? What are its options? Sure, it can sell some of it to China and India, but right now 50% of its oil exports go to the Europeans, 70% to the Western alliance. But most importantly, its entire oil infrastructure is skewed towards the West, whether this is pipelines, railways, ports, etc. So it's not very easy for them, if this demand gets shut off, that they can redirect these volumes quickly. They simply cannot sell that much to India and China. That escape valve, I think, is sort of overrated. In fact, if we look at what Putin did recently, he sort of told his ministers, please come up with new oil export infrastructure to friendly countries. So and this is not just Russia. It also requires cooperation from insurers, bankers, shippers, commodity traders, vessel owners, and many of these other parties would be very reluctant to run the risk of secondary sanctions, which I think is what is coming down the line. So most likely, Russia would actually have to stop production if these sanctions, these new round of sanctions, become effective. And I think this is a much greater threat to the Russian economy, since its source of revenues and foreign exchange is going to dry up.
Thanks for that, Professor Pushan Dutt. He's Professor of Economics and Political Science at INSEAD.